A Soldier's Christmas by Owen Oliver. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. I had spent 15 Christmas days with my battalion. Upon the 16th I woke far away from it, and I decided that since I couldn't have a soldier's Christmas, I wouldn't have any Christmas at all. I rang for my man as soon as it was light. He came in and saluted and stood at attention. I had warned him when I brought him out that if the army had done with me, I hadn't done with the army. So he observed military discipline. "You will take every Christmas card that comes this morning and put it on the fire," I commanded. "Yes, sir." "And everything that looks like a Christmas circular or an invitation or anything else, burn the lot." "Very good, sir." "And tell the porter that if anyone calls, I am out." "Yes, sir." "And tell his wife to send up just a plain lunch and dinner. If there's Christmas pudding or anything of that sort, she'll have no Christmas box from me. You'll make that perfectly clear." "Yes, sir." "The post should come about 11. When you have disposed of it, you can go for the day." "Thank you, sir." He fidgeted about in an unsoldierly fashion. "Quite sure you won't want me, sir?" "How dare you question my orders?" I snapped. "Do you think I don't know my own mind because I'm on the retired list?" That wasn't strictly correct, but they had told me that I should be gazetted out next week. "Beg pardon, sir. I was only thinking—" I cut him short. "A soldier doesn't think, he obeys. You and I are still soldiers, though a board of idiots say I'm physically unfit for further service. Unfit! I'd like to have the whole board in this room and show them who's physically unfit." I kicked off the bedclothes and jumped out of bed. "Give me the dumbbells and go and fetch my shaving water. Unfit indeed! A mere kink in the leg. Those fools at the War Office will sit up when they read my protest." "Yes, sir. They don't know what you did for the battalion, sir. The men are terribly cut up about you leaving, sir. Begging your pardon for mentioning it. I had a letter from Conky Davis." "Who?" I roared. 6243, A. Davis E. Company, sir. The one that—" "I know. There wasn't a man in the battalion that I didn't know all about. He says, if you'll excuse me for mentioning it, sir, that all the men say that Major Harder was the best—" "Stop!" I said. "Do you think I don't know how soldiers write? He doesn't say that." Harris fidgeted. "It comes to that, sir," he amended. "He calls me Old Mustard, eh?" I knew their name for me. "Yes, sir. It doesn't mean any harm. I know. Old Mustard, eh?" I rubbed my hands. "And what's the impudent scoundrel got to say of Old Mustard?" "His exact words," Harris told me solemnly, "begging your pardon, sir, were these: 'You always got it straight from him, and would rather be swore at by Old Mustard than kissed by the Colonel.'" I sat down on the bed suddenly. It upset me a bit to know that the boys remembered me like that. "Heaven bless 'em," I said. What are you gaping at? Go and get that shaving water." I understood the chaps, and if I'd lost both arms and both legs I'd have been able to manage the battalion. That's what those clever gentlemen at the War Office didn't realise. I don't say they didn't mean to treat me well, but what's the use of a DSO and a wounds pension to a man who can't go on soldiering? And to turn him off just before Christmas, of all times. However, the Colonel said in his letter that he was carrying out my plans for the Christmas dinner and the presents afterwards. That was some consolation. I shaved and dressed and had breakfast. Then I hobbled out for a walk in the park. At least I started to go there, but there were so many children and beggars wishing me a Merry Christmas that I soon returned to the flat again. They didn't know any better. But my relatives and friends, who kept writing to ask me to keep Christmas with them, ought to have had more sense.
He might have known that there wasn't any Christmas for a man who had been turned out of the army. I hoped that every member of the medical board might be choked by his Christmas dinner. Physically unfit, indeed. I'd have knocked out any two of them in 5 minutes if I'd had them in a 10-foot ring. When I returned, Harris was waiting on the doormat with a handful of letters. "I wasn't quite sure if I understood the orders, sir," he declared. "There's one letter in particular that—" He didn't get any further. I have told off a few soldiers in my time for slackness in carrying out orders, but I surpassed myself on this occasion. Harris ran off to the kitchen fire in such a hurry that he even forgot to salute. I think he was ashamed of himself, for he was particularly anxious to make me comfortable before he went. I got him out of trouble when he was young and raw, and the beggar was always grateful. He was so cut up when I was invalided that I had to bring him away with me. When he had departed, I got out all my papers — I'd kept them from the First Gazette — and read them through. Then I read a letter from the adjutant, which I liked better than the official documents. "You'll still be running the regiment," he wrote. "When I succeeded you as adjutant 3 years ago, I knew that I'd stepped into the shoes of a man, and I made up my mind to fill them. You have helped me to do so all the time, and thanks to your teaching, I think I shall be able to carry on as you'd have me carry on. I shall always feel that it's your regiment." That was how I felt about it. The last 2 colonels had been easy-going men. They left everything to me when I was adjutant, and they always consulted me afterwards. I had a note before me now, asking my advice about some difficulties with the double-company messing system. I wrote the answer on the spot and sealed it up. I hoped that Harris hadn't burnt anything from the battalion. I hadn't thought to mention that service letters were not to be included in the bonfire. I always was a hasty beggar. Old Mustard. The boys knew me. I had begun a letter to the adjutant advising him to watch C Company, whose captain was too fidgety with the men, and to make sure that F Company wasn't too much in the hands of the pay sergeant. I'd court-martial every officer who leaves cash payments to a sergeant if I had my way. I was going on to the question of non-regulation boots when I heard the front door bell. I didn't answer it and didn't mean to. But presently I heard someone come into the hall. I hadn't looked up after Harris. I hobbled to the door of the room as fast as I could go. "What the deuce do you mean by entering my hall?" I shouted. And then I stopped, for the intruder was my cousin Alice, Mrs. Barkham. We had been like brother and sister since we were children toddling together. She smiled, and I frowned. "Well, what the deuce do you mean by it, Alice?" I asked. "You were brought up as a sportswoman. You ought to know that there's a close time for an old badger who's licking his wounds in his lair." Alice came and put her gloved hand on my shoulder and kissed me. "I know," she said. "Dear old man, I felt so bad about it that I had to come to the wounded soldier." "I'm not a soldier any longer," I growled. "They're turning me out of the army. Physically unfit. The fools." "You are a soldier," she contradicted, "and you'll always be a soldier. And you're coming back with me to spend Christmas like a soldier. A soldier," she put her hand on my arm again, "who is too brave to let his troubles hurt his friends. There is a certain silly old friend who has had a little cry on Christmas morning over a letter, Dickie." "Dash it all!" I cried. "You don't mean to say that you—" "Come, come, commanding officer." I always called her that. "Settle the case summarily. I've been malingering in hospital instead of doing my duty. I'm an idiot. What's the punishment?" "The punishment," she said, "is to come back with me and spend Christmas like a soldier who doesn't mean to mourn about the soldiering that he can't do,
but to do manfully the soldiering that he can."
"That isn't much, Al," I said mournfully. "I was all right in the regiment, but I'm no use out of it, or in it now."
"No use!" she cried, tossing back her head as she always did when she was very much in earnest. "No use! Why, Dicky, just think. What's the principal work of an old soldier? What would yours have been if you'd stayed on and commanded the battalion? You would, of course. Isn't it to make soldiers? Well, you've trained plenty of fellows to do that. So many that your work will go on without you. You're still training the battalion, Dicky."
"That's what Lane said," I owned.
Lane is the adjutant.
"It sounds very nice, rather like an after-dinner speech. But I prefer to be doing soldiers' work myself, not by deputy."
"And you will. Unless I'm very much mistaken, you'll soon find some way of being useful to the army. For one thing, you'll put soldiers' hearts into lads, into mine. Now, Dicky, get your hat and coat and come and do your soldiering. Show us how a brave soldier fights trouble and keeps a cheerful face and— Poor old man!"
Her voice quivered suddenly, and she pulled out her handkerchief. "For goodness' sake, don't," I begged. "Look here, you just be a brave soldier too, old girl. No waterworks."
"I'm not," she denied gallantly. "Don't be a donkey. The cold has caught my eyes, that's all. Hurry up, you slow soldier."
I hurried up and went off with her. I hailed a taxicab and gave Alice's address, and we drove away. I meant to turn my mind right off the service, but Alice artfully led me on to talk about military affairs, and when I once started I went on till we reached her road. "I've been boring you," I apologized then.
"Indeed you haven't," she cried. "It has been most interesting. I had no idea that officers thought out things like that. Why, the management of a regiment seems to be a regular science, with laws and principles."
"It ought to be," I told her, "but it generally isn't. Most fellows just muddle along from one thing to another and never grasp the principles of regimental economy. It doesn't occur to them that there are principles. That's the deuce of it. I always found them ready enough to do things in the proper way when I pointed it out."
"Then," she said, "why don't you write a book of proper ways? That would be big soldier work, Dicky. You'd be making thousands of good soldiers all through the army."
"I'm not much good with the pen," I confessed. "I can talk to soldiers, but I'm afraid I'm a bit blunt, you know." Alice laughed out loud.
"Old mustard," she said.
"Oh, you know, do you?"
"Of course I do. If you wrote bluntly, not too much mustard, it would be all the better. General Lorringham wrote to me about you when you got the D.S.O., and he said that everybody knew your courage, but what they didn't know was your remarkable understanding of regimental management. Write a good, blunt book about it, Dicky."
"Nobody will read it," I grunted, "outside the regiment."
"One will," she asserted.
"That is how the management of a regiment came to be written. It is in the 3rd edition, and they use it as a textbook. If it is any good, the army have to thank my cousin Alice and another lady. I'm coming to her presently." Alice's jovial husband met me on the doorstep. "Good old man," he cried. "I thought the commanding officer would drag you out. Now you realise the despotism I endure. If I didn't kiss her under the mistletoe— there, fair lady— I'd get no Christmas dinner. Well, I am glad to see you. What are they thinking of to lose a chap like you for a bit of a limp? Hello, here's the army." My niece rushed at me and dragged me under the mistletoe with a shout of Uncle!" They call me that. Then the boys flew out to shake hands. "By Jove!" I cried. "How you've all grown! Here, give me a shoulder, Chris, and I'll do without the stick. Santa Claus been, eh? What? Believe I sent some of them? As if I would. Yes, yes, I'll come." They hauled me into the breakfast room, and Chris sat on my knee, and the boys stood close by and began asking questions. They wanted to know all about the fight for which I got the DSO. "The fight, eh?" I said. "It was just a wretched little affair in the hills. A lot of black chaps sniping and bolting whenever we tried to rush them. The leg, oh, that was a poke with a rusty sword. It wouldn't have been anything if it had been doctored at once. Why wasn't it? Because there wasn't a doctor handy. We were cut off for 5 days." "The whole regiment?" "No, about 30 of us to begin with." "How did it happen?" "Well, the niggers made a rush and got 6 of our chaps, and the colonel let me go at night with a party to rescue them, because they weren't particularly nice to prisoners. We recovered our chaps all right, but we couldn't get away afterwards. Had to hold a sort of little temple till relief came." "Much to eat?" "No, not much. Plenty of water, thank heaven. That's the main thing." "How did I fight with my bad leg?" "Didn't seem to notice it much then. It got worse afterwards." "How many men did I shoot?" "I never was much good at arithmetic, and Chris doesn't want to hear about that." "What was the temple like?" "Well, get me some paper and I'll draw it." I spent the next hour describing the campaign to Chris and the boys. Arthur is 15 and Dick, he was named after me, 14. They both said that they wanted to be soldiers as soon as they could. I told them that they could begin making themselves soldiers now, because the first thing was to obey orders and to obey them smartly. I promised to ask their father to let them learn fencing at school, and gave them an elementary lesson with walking sticks. Chris said she would like to be a nurse and nurse soldiers, and I told her a few things about first aid. I felt I'd spent quite a soldier's morning when the gong sounded for early dinner. I will confess that I was a bit of a coward when I went down to dinner. The holly and decorations made me think of the old mess room. I'm afraid I was a little remiss in talking to the lady whom I took in, till I noticed her smile at me. "I beg your pardon," I apologized. "I was thinking—" I paused. "Of a soldier's Christmas," she said. "So was I. You don't remember me?" "Good gracious!" I cried. "Ethel! I mean, Mrs. Meadows." "Her father was colonel of the East Farshire, and we were together in Ceylon. She was just a flapper then, and we won the mixed doubles in the Garrison tennis tournament. She married Meadows, a subaltern in the West Loamshire. He wasn't much good, and died 2 years afterwards." "Yes," she said. "You were adjutant of your battalion just before we left, and father said, 'Now they'll soon be soldiers.' I wasn't a bit surprised when I heard of the Pindy affair and your DSO. Do you remember how I used to wish I'd been born a boy to go into the army, and you called me young soldier?" "And you called me old soldier. The chaps called me Old Mustard afterwards."
"They always have a name for the right sort. I know Tommy." Her eyes glistened. "You disciplined me, I remember."
"That was how we won the tournament," I reminded her. "You obeyed orders and ran up and volleyed like a boy instead of playing a girl's backline game. You see, I judged my soldier before I gave orders."
"And I judged my leader before I obeyed them," she replied in her old daring way.
"And threatened him too," I said. "When you were grown up you disciplined me, you said. Perhaps you would have if you hadn't gone so far away." I smiled at her. I used to call her my little sweetheart.
"I went further," she said, "and fared not too well." She sighed. Do you know, I always feel as if I want to be back with the regiment. You see, father had no boy, and so he used to talk to me. And mother was a soldier at heart, a better soldier than some men." Her lip curled. "I ought to have been Mrs. Colonel somebody. I would have looked after my battalion."
"If I hadn't had this little accident to my leg," I jested, "I might have been able to offer you the appointment."
"I might have taken it," she retorted with a flash of her old merriment. "And then you would have been sorry for yourself."
"Only for you," I declared. "If you remember, I used to tell you that if I could choose my age, I'd be 5 years older than my young soldier."
Now we're both old soldiers on the retired list, and I haven't got a DSO. And what are you going to do? You mustn't waste all your soldier craft. Father always said that someone like you, a real regimental expert, ought to write a book, instead of leaving staff college men to teach the regimental officer to suck eggs."
"Alice has been talking to you," I remarked. "Or you to Alice."
"Both," she confessed.
"You want to find something to amuse an old mustard," I said.
"We do," she replied frankly. "You see, we both think a good deal of him, and I rather fancy we've found the right amusement. Seriously now."
"Well," I said, "I'm no writer, but if I understand anything, it's regimental duties. You see—" And then I launched off into my favourite topic. It lasted through dinner. "You've let me bore you to give an old soldier a pleasant Christmas," I said when we rose.
"I would have let you bore me," she said smilingly, "with that object. But as it happens, you haven't. Oh, don't I wish I could help you write that book! I dare say you'll write a dozen. You call yourself old, but you're only, let me think, about 37.
"That's it. And you're 24.
25, she corrected.
"If you were 5 years older," I jested, "there'd be the appointment of Mrs. Major Military Author."
"You'd better be careful," she warned me laughingly. "There's a DSO, and I always wanted a decoration." "Well," Alice asked when we were together for a moment, "hadn't I a nice surprise for you?"
"Very nice," I agreed. "I always liked that girl, so frank and honest. It's a pity she didn't marry a real soldier. Her heart's in the service. I never met such a regular army woman."
"If a certain old soldier had had more sense," Alice observed, "I rather think—"
"You ridiculous matchmaking creature!" I cried. "She was a mere schoolgirl, and looked upon me as a sort of uncle. She never had any other idea."
"Humph!" said Alice. "Girls have all sorts of ideas. A lot you know about women. No, I don't suppose she had any serious idea, but she was uncommonly pleased when she found that she was going to meet you."
"Now look here," I protested. "Don't put foolish thoughts into the head of a man who's unfit for further service. The idiots!
"Hush!" Alice entreated.
So I hushed, but I felt myself looking fierce for some time afterwards. If it hadn't been for the 3 confounded pill-boxes on that board, I might have had a Mrs. Colonelship to offer to anyone who seemed suitable. However, I was soon dragged out of my corner to play blind man's buff and snapdragon and a dozen other games. Then we had supper, and then the children went to bed. I was going home, but Alice and her husband said that there was a spare room, and I must stay the night. So I stayed. Ethel, I had taken to calling her that again, was staying there too, and the 4 of us sat round the stove. "Harris will be worrying about me," I remarked.
"Oh, no, he won't," Alice assured me. "I met him, and I told him I should bring you back and keep you."
"Such conduct," I protested, "is subversive of discipline."
"Al doesn't believe in other people's discipline," her husband remarked. "It depends," she said. "Discipline means obeying proper orders and disobeying foolish ones. Now, confess, Dick, haven't you sometimes wished that an order had been disobeyed?"
"Never," I asserted. "But I've sometimes wished that I hadn't given it."
"For example," she remarked, "when you ordered a whole post of letters to be burnt. Suppose there was an official letter among them, and the person to whom you gave the order was quite sure that you didn't mean that."
"He'd no business to mention it to you," I cried. "And if he's disobeyed my orders, I'll discharge the scoundrel to-morrow.
I paused for words suitable for ladies' ears, and then Ethel's quiet voice interposed. "Isn't it discipline to carry out orders in the spirit?" she asked. "Now, don't say that would end by not carrying them out at all. That's quite true of the rank and file. But, you see, Harris is your second in command for the moment, and he takes thought for you. Anyhow, you can take his good intention into account in sentencing him."
"It's you who ought to write a book," I told her. "A lawyer's book." She laughed.
"But I've got over you," she asserted. "You won't do anything to poor Harris?"
"No," I said. "No. I suppose you've the letter, Alice?"
"Yes," she said. "It's from the War Office. I'll give it to you before I go to bed."
"No," I said. "Give it to me now. I appealed, of course, but I knew it was no good. I suppose they're right. I'm too lame for duty. No, only for that particular duty. You two good women have disciplined me to-day and stopped me from growing into a miserable old grumbler. I'll find some duty in life, and, please heaven, I'll do it. What's more, I'll do it without whining that it isn't exactly the duty that I love the old regiment."
A woman's hand touched each of my arms.
"The decision was the only possible one, really, and I only appealed to blow off steam, instead of accepting the verdict like a good soldier. They can't possibly alter it. I have to read the letter sometime, so I'll just glance at it and get it over." I opened the letter, and then I don't know quite what I said or did. My chair seemed to be sailing through the air. When it came to anchor on the hearthrug, old George was pumping my hand, and Alice and Ethel were holding my arms. They were laughing and wiping their eyes. Ethel picked up the letter from the hearthrug and waved it as if she were a flapper again.
"Soldier!"
she cried, saluting as if she were one.
"Soldier!"
I rose, holding my chair, and saluted her. I knew very certainly, one sees things clearly in those great moments, that I had found my commanding officer. My heart was too full to speak. For the letter said that, while regretting that my return to regimental duty was not practicable, the War Office considered that my knowledge of regimental economy would be valuable in the Adjutant General's department, and offered me a staff appointment instead of retirement.
"It's a soldier's Christmas after all, Dickie," Alice said, and kissed me. "Let's go and look at the children, George. I always do when I'm specially happy."
They went off, and Ethel and I were left alone. "Ethel," I said, "there's only one thing wanting to make my next soldier's Christmas perfect. A real soldier's wife. There hasn't been any one, because they didn't come up to the dear soldier girl whom I used to know. It isn't a good enough appointment for you."
"It happens to be an appointment I like,"
she told me.
"Oh, Dick, this is my best soldier's Christmas." End of A Soldier's Christmas by Owen Oliver. Recording by Ruth Golding. Christmas 2014.